There are certain experiences in life that completely change the way you look at people forever. Not in a dramatic movie like way, not overnight, but slowly, quietly. You begin noticing things you never noticed before: patterns, contradictions, manipulation, emotional detachment, charm that suddenly turns cold. The way someone can look you in the eyes and lie without flinching. The way some people seem to lack empathy in situations where empathy should naturally exist. And for a lot of people, especially after deeply painful relationships or experiences, this creates a kind of obsession with understanding the human psyche, not from judgment, but from shock, confusion, curiosity, trying to make sense of what you experienced. And honestly, that's part of why I wanted to make this episode. I've always had a fascination with the human mind, but after my own personal experiences with a narcissistic psychopath, which you would hear about in my first few episodes, I became deeply interested in understanding how certain personality structures develop. I started to ask questions like, how does someone become this way? Are people born without empathy or born narcissists? What actually separates narcissism from psychopathy or sociopathy? Can someone truly love if they have these disorders? And is this something biological, psychological, environmental, or all of the above? I think one of the hardest things after experiencing someone emotionally manipulative or psychologically harmful is realizing how difficult it can be to understand them through a normal emotional lens. You keep trying to apply empathy to someone who may not emotionally process reality the same way you do. And that can leave people emotionally exhausted and deeply confused. So, in this episode, I really want to explore personality disorders from both a scientific and psychological perspective, while also discussing the deeper emotional and spiritual questions many people have after encountering these kinds of personalities. Conversations around narcissism, psychopathy, and sociopathy have exploded online over the past few years, but a lot of those conversations lack depth. Everything becomes oversimplified. Everyone gets labeled a narcissist. Every toxic relationship gets reduced to buzzwords. And while awareness is important, understanding matters too. These are real psychological conditions involving complex combinations of genetics, childhood environment, trauma, brain development, attachment patterns, emotional conditioning, and neurological differences. And honestly, the human mind is far more complicated than people realize. Now, before getting into narcissism, psychopathy, and sociopathy specifically, it's important to understand what personality disorders actually are. A personality disorder is generally considered a long term pattern of thinking, behaving, relating, and emotionally responding that becomes rigid, unhealthy, and disruptive to relationships or functioning. Everyone has personality traits. Everyone has flaws. Everyone can be selfish, insecure, manipulative, emotionally reactive, avoidant, or controlling sometimes. And that alone does not mean someone has a personality disorder. What makes personality disorders different is the consistency, severity, rigidity, and impact on functioning and relationships. These patterns become deeply ingrained. They shape identity itself. And psychology categorizes personality disorders into different clusters. Cluster A includes disorders often associated with odd or eccentric thinking patterns, such as paranoid personality disorder and schizoid personality disorder. Cluster B is the cluster most people become fascinated by because it involves dramatic, emotional, erratic, or manipulative personality structures. And this includes narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder. Then there's cluster C, which involves anxious or fearful personality styles, including avoidant personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now, one thing I think is really important to say before going deeper into this: having a personality disorder does not automatically make someone evil. That distinction truly matters. Mental illness and maliciousness are not identical things. Some people with personality disorders are highly self aware and actively seek treatment. Some become harmful, some become abusive, some don't. And that complexity matters because the internet often removes nuance completely. But at the same time, we also cannot ignore the real damage certain personality structures can cause, especially when severe, untreated, and combined with manipulation, aggression, exploitation, or lack of empathy. And I think that's why narcissism, psychopathy, and sociopathy fascinate people so deeply. Because these disorders challenge our assumptions about empathy, morality, emotional attachment, and even what it means to be human. Let's start with narcissism, because this is probably the term most commonly used today. Narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is characterized by patterns or grandiosity, need for admiration, entitlement, lack of empathy, and an unstable sense of self worth hidden underneath external confidence. And one of the biggest misconceptions about narcissists is that they secretly love themselves deeply. Most true narcissists actually have extreme, fragile self esteem underneath the grandiosity. The arrogance, superiority, validation seeking, image obsession, and control are often defenses protecting a deeply unstable identity. Now, this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but psychologically, narcissism is often understood as a defensive structure. Many narcissists experienced environments where love was conditional, emotionally inconsistent, excessively critical, emotionally neglectful, or heavily performance based. Some were overly praised without emotional grounding. Some experienced shame so deep that the personality developed grandiosity as protection. The child learns if I'm perfect, admired, superior, impressive, needed, or powerful, then I'll be safe. So, underneath narcissism is often profound insecurity. But because vulnerability feels intolerable, the narcissistic personality creates a full self, a constructed identity designed to avoid shame and maintain control. And this is why narcissists often struggle deeply with criticism and self image and how they are perceived. Even small criticism can feel psychologically threatening because it destabilizes the identity structure, protecting their self worth. This can lead to narcissistic rage, defensiveness, blame shifting, gaslighting, manipulation, emotional punishment, or devaluation. And honestly, one of the most confusing things about narcissistic relationships is the duality. At first, narcissists can appear incredibly charming, attentive, emotionally intense, charismatic, and even deeply interested in you. This is often referred to as idealization. But eventually, once attachment forms, the dynamic often changes. Criticism appears, emotional invalidation appears, control appears, hot and cold behavior appears. And many people become trapped trying to regain that person that they were initially with. Psychologically, narcissists usually still experience emotions. They can feel envy, shame, anger, validation needs, jealousy, emotional injury. But empathy is often impaired, inconsistent, or conditional. The focus remains heavily self centered. Keep in mind that there are different narcissistic personality disorders, which I'm not going to get into in this, maybe in a different episode, but there is covert narcissists, which are a little bit more hidden. They are not as grandiose and flamboyant. One person I usually talk about when I'm thinking about a flamboyant narcissist would be like Donald Trump, right? But a covert narcissist is a lot more quiet, a lot more under the belt. Now let's move to psychopathy, because this is where things become even more psychologically fascinating. Psychopathy is not technically an official DSM diagnosis in the same way narcissistic personality disorder is. Instead, psychopathy is often discussed as a severe subset of antisocial personality traits. And psychopathy tends to involve traits like superficial charm, emotional detachment, manipulation, shallow affect, lack of remorse, low fear response, impulsivity, calculated behavior, and reduced empathy. Now, scientifically, psychopathy is incredibly interesting because researchers have found neurological differences associated with psychopathic traits. Brain imaging studies have shown reduced activity in areas connected to emotional processing, fear conditioning, empathy, and moral decision making, particularly involving the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. So, in real world terms, they actually don't experience electricity in certain parts of their brain that loves people, that cares about others, and that cares and that has empathy. The amygdala plays a major role in emotional processing and fear responses. Some studies suggest psychopaths have reduced fear conditioning and reduced emotional responses compared to the average person due to the electrical responses in the brain, which means they may not emotionally process guilt, fear, or distress the same way neurologically. And honestly, this is where people begin asking the deeper questions. Are psychopaths born or created? And scientifically, the answer appears to be both biological and environmental. Research strongly suggests genetics play a significant role in psychopathic traits. Temperament differences can appear very early in life. Some children naturally show lower fear responses, lower emotional sensitivity, or reduced empathy compared to others. But environment matters too. Trauma, abuse, neglect, attachment disruption, violence, emotional deprivation, all of these can influence personality development significantly. So it's not usually one simple answer. It's an interaction between biology and environment. And this is true for many psychological conditions. Now, one major difference often discussed between narcissists and psychopaths is emotional motivation. Narcissists usually still crave validation and emotional supply. Psychopaths may be more emotionally detached altogether, more calculating, more predatory, more capable of manipulation without emotional attachment. And unlike a narcissist, psychopaths often display remarkably low anxiety and low fear. And that emotional coldness can make them appear very calm under pressure and in ways that truly make people feel very unsettled. Now, sociopathy is another term people hear constantly. And this is where things get complicated because sociopathy and psychopathy are not formally separate DSM diagnoses. Both are generally associated with antisocial personality disorder, but clinically, people often distinguish them differently. Psychopaths are usually described as more calculated, emotionally cold, controlled, and neurologically detached. Sociopaths are often described as more impulsive, reactive, emotionally volatile, and shaped more heavily by environmental trauma and social conditioning. A sociopath may still form attachments to certain individuals or groups, though often in distorted ways. Psychopaths are generally viewed as more emotionally detached overall. And honestly, I think one reason these personality structures fascinate people so deeply is because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about empathy and morality. Most people assume that empathy is universal, that conscious functions are similar in everyone. But psychology shows that emotional processing varies dramatically across individuals. And that realization can feel deeply unsettling. A lot of people find it hard to believe or come to terms with the fact that others can do things that they can't process in their own mind or that they wouldn't do. And the reality is that everybody's brain works differently. Everybody has different levels of empathy. Everybody shows love differently. Some people can't genuinely have those feelings or experiences. Some people are just cold and calculated. And I think for people that are not like that, and unless you've been in a situation where you've dealt with people that are like that, it's hard to believe or realize that these type of people are actually out there. One of the hardest things after dealing with a narcissist or psychopathic personalities is realizing that you may have been emotionally interpreting someone through your own capacity for empathy. You assume they feel guilt because you would. You assume they care because you would. You assume honesty matters because it matters to you. And that projection creates confusion, especially when behavior repeatedly contradicts empathy. Now, I also want to discuss trauma because trauma plays a huge role in personality development overall. Not everyone who experiences trauma develops personality disorders, but most do. But chronic childhood trauma, Emotional neglect, abuse, instability, inconsistent attachment, violence, and early environmental stress absolutely affect brain development and emotional regulation, especially during childhood when the brain is still developing. Children learn emotional regulation through relationships. They learn safety through attachment. They learn empathy through being empathized with. So, when childhood environments are severely dysfunctional, emotionally cold, abusive, or chaotic, personality development can become distorted. And honestly, this is one reason generational trauma is such an important conversation. Unhealed emotional patterns often repeat across generations unless consciously interrupted. Now, one thing I find incredibly important is discussing the importance between narcissistic traits and full narcissistic personality disorder. Because social media has created an environment where every selfish behavior gets labeled narcissism, but narcissism actually is a spectrum. Having narcissistic traits sometimes is being human. People can become defensive, self centered, validation seeking, attention seeking, controlling, especially during insecurity or stress. So, this doesn't always mean that somebody is a narcissist. A disorder involves pervasive patterns across relationships and situations constantly over time. And honestly, labeling everyone a narcissist can sometimes prevent people from recognizing broader emotional complexity. And also makes it a lot harder for people that are narcissists or dealing with true narcissists to be believed because it's such a wide used term now. Now, people who have genuinely experienced severe narcissistic or psychopathic abuse often know, well, not often, but they know the psychological impact is extremely real. Gaslighting alone can profoundly destabilize someone psychologically. For people who are unfamiliar with the term gaslighting, gaslighting involves manipulating someone into doubting their own reality, memory, perception, or emotional experience. And over time, chronic gaslighting can deeply affect self trust. This is why many survivors of narcissistic relationships feel emotionally disoriented afterward. They begin questioning themselves constantly. They have a hard time connecting back to their intuition because a lot of times in those relationships, too, they're actually being told to not trust your intuition, to not trust how you're feeling, to not trust those red flags. You're the problem. It's all on you. And that is the gaslighting. And when you are recovering from psychologically manipulative relationships, you do have to rebuild trust with your own mind again. You have to rebuild trust with your intuition. And I have other episodes on that, intuition versus fear and past episodes. So if you're new to the podcast, make sure you check out those episodes. But you do have to rebuild that relationship with yourself again. You have to reestablish your boundaries. You have to learn to believe your intuition again and learn to trust the red flags and to trust your instincts. Healing after these experiences is not only intellectual, it's emotional, energetic, and nervous system based. Many people leave these relationships carrying hypervigilance, anxiety, emotional confusion, self doubt, and trauma responses. The body remembers prolonged emotional stress. The nervous system adapts to unpredictability. And this is why healing often requires more than simply moving on. It requires nervous system regulation, self awareness, trauma healing, boundary rebuilding, identity rebuilding. Now, spiritually, I think experiences with narcissistic or psychopathic personalities often force people into a profound awakening. Painful awakening, but awakening nonetheless, because you start seeing human behavior differently. You start realizing that not everyone operates from the same emotional depth, empathy, or consciousness. And while that realization can feel painful, it also creates discernment. You stop confusing charm with character. You stop ignoring red flags. You stop abandoning your intuition for potential. And honestly, one thing I've personally reflected on deeply is how empathy can sometimes become dangerous when it lacks boundaries. Because empathetic people often over explain harmful behavior. They try to heal people who don't want healing. They search endlessly for the wounded child underneath destructive behavior. And while compassion matters, compassion without boundaries can become self destruction. Understanding why someone became harmful does not require tolerating harm. That distinction is incredibly important. I think many people become fascinated with psychology after painful relationships because understanding creates emotional closure where chaos once existed. Knowledge creates clarity. You stop personalizing everything. You also want to understand what you've been through. You realize manipulation patterns are often deeply psychological. You realize certain behaviors were not reflections of your worth. And that awareness can become incredibly freeing. Now, another interesting scientific area connected to psychopathy involves fear processing and punishment sensitivity. Research suggests some psychopathic individuals do not respond to punishment or fear conditioning the same way most people do. This affects learning, emotional processing, risk taking, and conscious development, which again raises profound questions around morality and free will. If someone's emotional brain processes empathy and fear differently neurologically, how much is choice and how much is biology? And psychology still debates many of these questions because the human brain remains incredibly complex. Now, treatment for personality disorders also varies significantly. Some personality disorders respond better to treatment than others. Borderline personality disorder, for example, often shows significant improvement with therapies like DBT. Narcissistic personality disorder can be difficult to treat because many narcissists resist vulnerability and accountability. They don't have that self-awareness to really look in the mirror and say, okay, I am a narcissist. They don't really have a lot of self-awareness or even look at themselves to say, what can I fix here? And psychopathy is often considered one of the most difficult personality structures to treat effectively, especially severe cases involving criminal behavior and lack of remorse. But again, human beings exist on spectrums. Not everyone with traits becomes violent or abusive. Not everyone with antisocial traits becomes a criminal. And this nuance does matter. I think it's really important to realize that human beings are capable of both incredible compassion and incredible emotional destruction. The psyche contains both light and shadow. And I think becoming conscious of that reality is part of maturity. Not becoming fearful of anyone, but becoming aware, grounded, discerned, emotionally intelligent. And honestly, one of the most healing things after painful experiences is realizing that someone else's inability to love properly was never proof of your lack of worth. That realization changes people because many survivors of narcissistic or psychopathic relationships internalize the damage deeply. They begin feeling unlovable, confused, emotionally broken. But often the issue was never their lack of value, it was the emotional limitations, pathology, trauma, or distorted personality structure of the other person. I think the more conscious we become about human behavior, emotional patterns, and trauma, empathy, manipulation, and healing, the more intentional we can move through relationships and life itself. And maybe that's the real transformation after painful experiences, not becoming hardened or bitter, but becoming wiser, more discerning, more emotionally aware, more connected to your own truth than ever before. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the different personality disorders. I'll probably end up talking about this even further in other episodes because it really, truly fascinates me. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Adeana's Diary. Don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode every Wednesday at 9 a.m. And I will connect with you in the next one.